Imagine you are the driver of a runaway trolley car hurtling down a track at 60 miles an hour. Straight ahead, you see 5 workers standing on the track, tools in hand. You try to stop, but your brakes fail. You feel desperate because you know that if you smash into these 5 workers, they will all die. Suddenly, you notice a side track to the right. On that track, there is only 1 worker. You realize that you can steer the trolley car onto the side track, killing the 1 worker, but sparing the 5. What would you do? Most people say, turn. If you can save 5 lives by sacrificing 1, that's the right thing to do. But now, imagine a different version. You are an observer on a bridge overlooking the track. There is no side track this time, but standing next to you is a very heavy man. If you push him off the bridge and onto the track, his bulk will stop the trolley. He will die, but the 5 workers will live. Now the math is the same, 1 life for 5. But suddenly the right thing to do feels a lot more complicated. Welcome to the world of Michael Sandel's Justice. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today, we are tackling a book that has transformed the way millions of people think about their daily lives, their politics, and their morals. We're talking about Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, by Harvard professor Michael Sandel. This isn't just a book of dry philosophy, it's a workout for your conscience. In this episode, we are going to navigate the treacherous waters of moral dilemmas. We're going to talk about price gouging during disasters, the ethics of organ selling, and whether it's ever okay to lie. By the end of this journey, you won't just know what Sandel thinks, you'll have a much clearer map of your own moral compass. We'll explore the 3 main ways of thinking about justice: maximizing welfare, respecting freedom, and promoting virtue. It's going to be a wild ride through the history of ideas, so let's dive right in. Let's start with a real-world example that actually happened. In 2004, Hurricane Charley roared across the Gulf of Mexico and hit Florida. It left a trail of destruction, but in its wake came another storm, a debate over price gouging. A gas station in Orlando was selling $2 bags of ice for $10. Tree removal services were charging $23,000 to clear 2 trees. People were outraged. The Attorney General called it greed that happened after a storm. But some economists argued that the high prices were actually fair because they reflected supply and demand. They argued that high prices encourage people to consume less and encourage suppliers from far away to bring more goods to the disaster zone. So who is right? Is justice simply about whatever the market decides, or is there a moral limit to what we can charge someone in their moment of desperation? This brings us to our first major school of thought, utilitarianism. This is the philosophy of Jeremy Bentham, an 18th-century English philosopher. Bentham's idea was incredibly simple, and to many, incredibly cold. He argued that the highest principle of morality is to maximize happiness, or what he called utility. He defined utility as anything that produces pleasure or happiness and prevents pain or suffering. His slogan was the greatest good for the greatest number. To a utilitarian, justice isn't about some abstract set of rights, it's a math problem. If you're that trolley driver, you turn the wheel because 5 units of life are worth more than 1 unit of life. It's a very logical, efficient way to look at the world, but it has some terrifying consequences. Think about the ancient Romans throwing Christians to the lions in the Colosseum. If enough Romans, let's say 50,000 of them, get an incredible amount of pleasure from watching the spectacle, does that outweigh the intense pain of the 1 person being eaten? If you follow Bentham's math strictly, the answer might be yes. This is the minority rights problem. If the majority finds pleasure in the suffering of a minority, utilitarianism struggles to explain why that is wrong. It treats all pleasures as equal. It doesn't distinguish between the pleasure of reading a great book and the pleasure of watching someone get hurt, as long as the intensity and duration are the same. Before we move on to the man who tried to save utilitarianism, let's take a quick breather. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the big questions of life, do us a huge favor. If you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. It really helps the algorithm recognize that deep thinking is still alive and well in 2026. And if you've ever felt like you were being price gouged by a delivery app on a rainy night, this episode is definitely for you. Now, back to the math of happiness. John Stuart Mill was a follower of Bentham, but he realized that the pleasure is pleasure argument was a bit thin. He tried to fix it by suggesting that there are higher and lower pleasures. He famously said, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." Mill argued that if we protect individual liberty in the long run, it will lead to the greatest human happiness. He tried to make utilitarianism more human, but in doing so, he almost moved away from the core idea. He started to value human dignity as something that shouldn't be traded, even for a high price of collective happiness. But what if you don't care about the collective? What if justice is purely about individual choice? This leads us to our second big framework, libertarianism. This is the "don't tread on me" school of thought. Libertarians argue that each of us has a fundamental right to liberty, the right to do whatever we want with the things we own, provided we respect other people's rights to do the same. The core of libertarianism is the idea of self-ownership. I own my body, my mind, and my labor. Therefore, if I work and earn money, that money belongs to me. This leads to some very controversial conclusions. For a strict libertarian, wealth redistribution, taxing the rich to help the poor, is a form of theft, or even worse, a form of forced labor. If the government takes 30% of my earnings, they are essentially forcing me to work 30% of my time for them. It's like a partial form of slavery. They also argue against paternalism, laws that protect us from ourselves, like seatbelt laws or motorcycle helmet laws. If I want to risk my life, that's my business, as long as I don't crash into you. Sandel uses the example of Michael Jordan, or in today's terms, maybe someone like Steph Curry, or a high-earning YouTuber. If millions of people voluntarily pay $5 each to watch a person perform, and that person ends up with $30 million, is that unjust? The libertarian says no. The exchange was voluntary. No one was robbed. So why should the government be allowed to take a cut of that to build a library or a hospital? It sounds logically consistent, but it pushes us into uncomfortable territory. Does self-ownership mean I should be allowed to sell my organs? If I own my body, why can't I sell my second kidney to the highest bidder on eBay? Most of us recoil at that idea, but the libertarian asks, if you don't own your own kidney, who does? The state? As we move through these ideas, you might start to feel like a pendulum. On one hand, you want the greatest good for the greatest number. On the other hand, you don't want the majority to be able to vote away your house or your rights. This tension is where justice lives. It's not a settled science, it's a constant argument. Let's look at another case study Sandel mentions, the volunteer army. In the United States, we no longer have a draft, we have a professional army. From a market perspective, this is great. People choose to join and they get paid. It's a voluntary exchange. A utilitarian would say it's efficient. A libertarian would say it respects freedom. But then we have to ask, is it truly voluntary? If the majority of people joining the army is doing so because it's their only way to get a college education or escape poverty, is that a free choice or is it coercion by economic necessity? And is there something about military service or jury duty that is a civic obligation that shouldn't be for sale? If we turn everything into a commodity, if we can pay people to fight our wars, pay people to stand in line for us, or even pay people to carry our pregnancies as surrogates, do we lose something essential? Does the market price degrade the good being traded? This is the third pillar Sandel introduces, virtue. This school of thought goes all the way back to Aristotle. Aristotle argued that justice is about giving people what they deserve. And to figure out what people deserve, we have to figure out the telos, or the purpose of the thing we are talking about. Suppose we are distributing the best flutes. Who should get them? The richest people? The most beautiful people? No, says Aristotle. The best flutes should go to the best flute players. Why? Because that is what flutes are for, to be played well. To give them to someone who can't play is a waste of the instrument's purpose. This sounds simple, but when you apply it to modern society, it's explosive. It means that justice is tied to the good life. It means we can't talk about justice without talking about what we value as a society. Take the debate over golf. There was a famous court case involving a professional golfer named Casey Martin, who had a circulatory disorder that made it incredibly painful for him to walk the course.
Now, if you're feeling a bit dizzy from all these different ways of looking at the world, you're not alone. We've looked at the math of utilitarianism and the radical freedom of libertarianism. But now we have to meet the man who many consider the most difficult, but also the most profound philosopher of them all, Immanuel Kant. Kant doesn't care about your happiness. He doesn't care about the consequences of your actions. For Kant, morality isn't about the what, it's about the why. It's all about the motive. He argues that an action is only truly moral if it's done out of a sense of duty, doing the right thing simply because it's the right thing to do. Think about a shopkeeper who notices a child coming in to buy a loaf of bread. The shopkeeper could easily overcharge the child, and the child would never know. But the shopkeeper decides not to overcharge him, because if word got out, his reputation would be ruined, and he'd lose business. Is that a moral act? Kant says no. The shopkeeper did the right thing, but he did it for the wrong reason, self-interest. He was just being calculating. To be truly moral, he should have been honest simply because honesty is a duty. This brings us to one of the most famous concepts in philosophy, the categorical imperative. It sounds intimidating, but it's essentially a very strict version of the golden rule. Kant says we should act only according to rules that we would want to become a universal law. Before you act, ask yourself, would I want everyone else in the world to do exactly what I'm about to do? If you're thinking about making a false promise to get some money, you have to ask, what if everyone made false promises when they needed money? Well, the very concept of a promise would disappear. No one would believe anyone. Therefore, making a false promise is logically inconsistent and immoral. Kant also insists on something very beautiful, that we must treat people as ends in themselves, never merely as means to an end. This is the ultimate anti-utilitarian argument. You cannot use a human being as a tool to make the rest of society happier. You cannot push the heavy man off the bridge to save the 5 workers, because you are using that man's life as a mere instrument. Every human being has a dignity that is above all price. Now, Kant's philosophy is incredibly noble, but it's also incredibly demanding. It means you can never lie, not even a white lie. There's a famous example called the murderer at the door. If a friend is hiding in your house and a murderer knocks on the door and asks if your friend is there, Kant argues you cannot tell a flat-out lie. You can be misleading or you can say nothing, but you cannot violate the truth. This is where most people start to jump off the Kantian train. But his core message, that morality is about universal principles and human dignity, is the foundation of modern human rights. But how do we apply this dignity and rights talk to the way we build a society? How do we decide what's fair when we all have different interests? For that, we turn to the 20th century American philosopher John Rawls. Rawls proposes a fascinating thought experiment called the veil of ignorance. Imagine we are all gathered together to decide on the rules for our society. We're deciding on the taxes, the healthcare, the laws. But there's a catch. None of us knows who we are in the real world. You don't know if you're rich or poor, healthy or sick, a member of a majority religion or a minority one.
You don't even know your race or gender. You are behind a veil of ignorance. If you had to pick the rules of society behind that veil, what would you choose? You wouldn't choose a system where the majority can oppress the minority, because you might be the minority. You wouldn't choose a winner-take-all capitalist system, because you might be born into poverty. Rawls argues we would choose two things. First, basic liberties for everyone, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Second, what he calls the difference principle. This is the idea that social and economic inequalities are only allowed if they work to the benefit of the least advantaged members of society. In other words, it's okay for a surgeon to make more money than a janitor, but only if that higher pay attracts the best talent and leads to a healthcare system that helps the poorest people more than an equal system would. This is a radical way of thinking about talent. Rawls argues that your talents, the fact that you have a high IQ, or you're a great athlete, or you have a growth mindset, are largely the result of a natural lottery. You didn't earn your DNA. You didn't earn being born into a family that encouraged you. Therefore, you don't deserve all the rewards that come from those talents in a moral sense. You are entitled to them by the rules of the game, but society has a right to tax those rewards to help those who weren't as lucky in the lottery of life. Now, before we get to the final part of our journey, where we look at the politics of the common good and the controversial idea of collective responsibility, let's take a moment. If you're currently thinking about your own life, your job, or your bank account through the veil of ignorance, then we're doing our job. If you're finding value in these big ideas, please share this episode with someone who loves a good what-if scenario. Your support keeps the lights on here at the studio. We've come a long way. We've gone from the trolley track to the natural lottery. But there's one big question left. Is it possible to be a neutral society? Can we really decide what is just without talking about what is good? Most modern liberals, in the philosophical sense, say yes. They say the government should be a neutral framework that lets people choose their own values. But Sandel isn't so sure. He thinks we can't solve our heated debates, like those over marriage or life or the environment, without talking about the telos or the purpose of our social institutions. Think about the debate over same-sex marriage. For a long time, the argument was about neutrality and choice. But Sandel points out that even the courts eventually had to ask, what is the purpose of marriage? Is it just a private contract between two people, or is it a social institution meant to honor and celebrate a specific kind of committed relationship? You can't be neutral on that question. You have to take a stand on what marriage is for. This brings us to the final and perhaps most controversial topic, loyalties and memberships. Do we have obligations that we didn't choose? A libertarian would say no. I only have obligations to things I have consented to. But Sandel argues we are encumbered selves. We are born into families, nations, and histories. Do we have a special duty to our own citizens that we don't have to people in other countries? Do we have a responsibility to apologize for the wrongs committed by our ancestors, like slavery or the displacement of indigenous people, even if we personally didn't do those things? If you believe that you are a completely self-made individual with no ties to the past, you might say no. But if you believe that your identity is tied to your community and your history, then justice might require more than just not harming others. It might require solidarity.
Here is the final segment of the script, focusing on the common good, collective responsibility, and the closing summary to reach your target length and impact. This brings us to the most intimate and perhaps most difficult part of Sandel's argument, the idea of solidarity. For many of us, the idea that we are responsible for things we didn't personally do feels wrong. If I didn't own slaves, why should I pay reparations? If I wasn't alive during a war, why should my country apologize? The libertarian, or the Kantian liberal, would say that you are only responsible for your own choices. But Sandel argues that this view of the unencumbered self is too thin. He suggests that if we want to take pride in our country's achievements, to feel a thrill when our national team wins the World Cup, or pride in our nation's scientific breakthroughs, then we must also accept the moral burden of our nation's history. You can't have one without the other. Justice, in this sense, isn't just about individual rights, it's about the stories we belong to. This leads us to the politics of the common good. Sandel argues that for the last few decades, we've tried to keep our moral and religious convictions out of the public square. We've tried to be neutral, but he thinks this has left a vacuum that is often filled by narrow, intolerant fundamentalism. If we don't talk about what a just society looks like, if we don't talk about greed and sacrifice and the dignity of work, then we are just managing a market, not building a community. So, what would a politics of the common good actually look like? Sandel offers a few provocations. First, it would involve a renewed focus on citizenship and sacrifice. It might mean asking why we pay a hedge fund manager 1,000 times more than a school teacher. Is the value they provide to the common good really that lopsided? Second, it would mean looking at the moral limits of markets. We have to stop and ask, are there some things that money shouldn't be able to buy? We already agree you can't buy a vote, and you can't buy a human being. But what about the right to pollute? What about the spot at a prestigious university? What about the privilege of jumping the line at an emergency room? When we put a price tag on everything, we erode the commonness of our shared life. We end up in a world where the rich and the poor live entirely separate lives, never meeting in the same parks, the same schools, or the same public transport. Third, a politics of the common good would focus on solidarity and civic virtue. It would prioritize building the infrastructure of civic life, the libraries, the public squares, the community centers that bring people together. Justice isn't just about how we distribute things, it's about how we value things. As we bring this deep dive to a close, you might be wondering, so what's the answer? Which one is right? The truth is, Michael Sandel doesn't give us a final, tidy answer, and that's the point. Justice is a verb, not a noun. It's a process of public deliberation. It's about the hard work of being a citizen. It's about being willing to engage with people who have fundamentally different moral starting points than you do, and trying to find a path toward the common good. Before we wrap up, let's go over your justice cheat sheet to help you navigate your next political debate or moral dilemma. First, ask the utilitarian question. What will produce the most happiness for the most people? It's a great starting point for efficiency and welfare, but watch out for the rights of the minority. Second, ask the libertarian question. Does this respect individual choice and self-ownership? Am I treating someone as a person or just as a source of tax revenue? Third, ask the Kantian question. Is this act right in itself? Would I want this to be a universal law for everyone, everywhere? Fourth, ask the Rawlsian question. If I were behind the veil of ignorance and didn't know if I'd be the winner or the loser in this situation, would I still think this rule is fair? And finally, ask the Aristotelian question. What is the telos or the purpose of this institution? What virtues are we trying to honor and reward? Thank you so much for joining me on this marathon through the history of moral philosophy. I know we covered a lot of ground today, from runaway trolleys to the natural lottery of our DNA. These aren't just academic puzzles, they are the questions that define our laws, our relationships, and our character. If this episode made you think, or if it made you want to argue with me, then we've succeeded. If you found this helpful, please share it with one friend today, just one. Send them a link and ask them, would you push the heavy man off the bridge? It's a great conversation starter, I promise. A special thanks to our producers and to you, the listeners, for having the curiosity to engage with these big ideas. In a world of sound bites and 280-character arguments, taking 20 minutes to think deeply is a radical act of rebellion. Until next time, keep questioning, keep debating, and most importantly,
Keep striving to do the right thing, whatever you decide that may be. I'm signing off, but the conversation is just beginning.